I gave out the title of this talk as War is a Cash Cow, but I want to go a little farther than that. It's not just that we have permanent war in this country because the military, industrial, media complex profits, but there's a neocon agenda that goes towards, I mean, this sounds like something out of a James Bond movie, world domination. I wanted to back up a little and talk about the values we're supposed to have versus the values of the neocons. Because as humanists, we base our beliefs in the Enlightenment, right? In all men and women are created equal. In the greatest good for the greatest number. And I did a little searching around, and I found out that that phrase, which was originally the greatest happiness for the greatest number, Jeremy Bentham wrote about in 1768, but he actually picked it up from someone named Francis Hutcheson, who had written about it in 1725. So it goes back to, you might say, early liberalism at the time of John Locke, who was born in the 17th century. Then in 1785, Kant came out with his categorical imperative, which I'm sure you remember has two parts to it. Always treat human beings as ends and never as means to ends, which means the use of patsies in false flag operations is completely against Kant. And secondly, act as if everything you do were turned into a universal principle and everyone were doing it, right? And as a photographer, I'm afraid I can't adhere to that because I do climb over fences.
Good for you.
Yeah, I do go too. Yeah, the best photographs are often taken from the forbidden places.
Bridges, not
yeah.
fences.
But you know, they often have to put these restrictions up because they're dealing with 3-year-olds and people with unsure footing. Anyway, and then the preamble to our Constitution is from 1787. And let me just read you the relevant words. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, okay, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, right, police forces, provide for the common defense, okay, promote general welfare, okay, that's, you know, so everyone should be doing okay, and secure the blessings of liberty, meaning free speech, freedom of religion, the ability to have guns, to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution. Okay, that's the purpose. Okay, so this establishes our values as a country as humanist values. However, right, and of course we revolted against England because we figured out that the English ruling class, represented by the king, were treating us English people, right, without the proper, denying us the proper rights as English people. Now, they were also exploiting people elsewhere in the world, such as in India and in the Middle East, but they were not English people. So we were not standing up for their rights. And in fact, as I was doing a little research on Wahhabism, you know, the extremist, violent sect of Islam that's practiced and oh, that's wonderful, and disseminated by Saudi Arabia, I learned that the original Wahhab, al-Wahhab, was really a guy who was off his rocker in the 18th century. He was a little crazy, and he was very into. He said that, oh, the Muslims are into polytheism and immorality. He had 400 wives, but only 20 at any one time. Yeah, he was nutty, and he set up a little institution which the English fostered. They flattered him, and they saw that with his extreme sectarianism, he could cause dissent within the Arabs of that area, and it was the old divide and conquer strategy. And Wahhabism was then suppressed by the caliphate in Constantinople, right? The Ottoman caliph said that this guy's a nut off his rocker. He's doing terrible damage to Islam, and we have to get rid of him. So they did. But then it resurged. One of his relatives survived. It resurged in the 19th century, was again suppressed. And it was when it resurged, it was also fostered by the English. And then finally in 1902, it resurged again, and the British, now we're talking about the British Empire, took advantage of it once more and established the House of Saud, and that exists until the present day. They have destroyed Muslim shrines, even bombed the tomb of Muhammad, because they feel that they're afraid these things would become objects of worship and therefore idolatry. They're extreme purists, right? And it's this form of extreme Islam that is embraced by our great oil ally in the Middle East, namely Saudi Arabia. Now, I tell this story really more to illustrate the cynicism of the English in the 18th century, the British in the 19th century, in their pursuit of imperial goals. They were not interested in self-determination of peoples, right? And when people in this country realized that they weren't going to allow us the same rights as English people who stayed home, we revolted. And we connected the dots, ladies and gentlemen. And that's what the Declaration of Independence basically is. It's saying, okay, George III did all these things. He imposed the Stamp Act and taxed us and took away our rights in various ways, and what's the word? He fomented attacks among the indigenous population. In other words, they encouraged the Indians to attack the colonists. And they put all this stuff together and said, he's trying to take away our rights. He's treating us as third-class citizens. And so we're going to break away. Now, today, of course, the CIA would call that a conspiracy theory. And that's what it is. But they were right. They connected the dots. And that's often what a conspiracy theory is. Connecting the dots and coming up with an unofficial conclusion. A conclusion that flies in the face of the line that the authorities are trying to put forth. But we also get a sense that the imperialist goals and agendas of any empire do not include self-determination of its subject peoples. Smarter empires will foster local cultures, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire did that, and even the Ottoman Empire did that. The British Empire, though, was more interested in extracting wealth from its subject peoples and putting down revolts, as they did very ferociously in 1857 in India. And of course, and they set up a pattern of fostering sectarianism in the Middle East. And that practice continues to this day. So we have had there have been three viable secular ethnically Arab states in the Middle East, not necessarily democracies, but functioning states with a middle class, and which were more or less independent of American domination. And the neocons decided that we needed to dominate them, undermine their societies, destroy the structure of their societies, and break them up into statelets that didn't have that much power along sectarian lines. Remember, these were secular states. And what states am I talking about? Anybody? Iraq. What else?
Syria.
Syria, yes. And the third? Libya. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And the order was Iraq, Libya, Syria. Right? So they realized before 9/11, right, the Project for a New American Century people realized in the late 90s that we had to go after Iraq because the second largest oil deposits were there, and maybe 20% of that had been exploited so far. Huge oil reserves. And similarly for Libya, and for all of Gaddafi's and Saddam Hussein's repressiveness against their enemies, they nonetheless had a functioning society with social services and running water and electricity and universities and public transportation and museums and on and on. And that also existed in Syria. And there are great oil reserves in Syria. And so we and other NATO countries, along with Turkey, by the way, and Israel's a party to this, decided that we had to remove the government of Syria, the Assad government of Syria, and do that by creating a revolt and fostering groups that pretended to be extreme Islamist groups, such as ISIS, also known as ISIL, and Daesh. It's the same thing. And also as al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda in Syria. These groups are not authentic Muslim groups. And the book that I drew much of this from, which I'd love to share with you, even says that two of the leaders of ISIS in Syria were found to have ordered from Amazon Islam for Dummies. They're very telling. All right. So now I'm going to stop for a second and let us eat, namely let me eat because everyone else is eating, and resume from there and go into what the CIA's been up to. Okay. So let's pause with the neocon agenda in the Middle East, which is to break up functioning secular democracies, not democracies, secular states, democracy, into political division statelets based on sectarian and ethnic lines. So, for example, the Kurds are one of the earliest examples, right? We kind of saved the Kurds from oppression from Saddam Hussein and set up Kurdistan, and that's pretty much an inviolable territory. And there's a Kurdistan in Iraq, and there are a certain number of Kurds in Syria. The problem, of course, is Turkey, because they're hostile to the Kurds. So the Kurds depend on us, or have depended on us, for protection in Iraq.
And Armenians.
Oh, the Armenians, of course, but they have at least their own country now. Yeah, but the Turks have been very, very hard on ethnic groups not Turkish. And my private theory about that is because since the Turks themselves are interlopers in Anatolia, right? They came from what's now called Turkmenistan and finally succeeded in sacking Constantinople in May of 1453. And it was a very bloody event, even though people in Turkey say that they spared women and children, but that's not what my sources say. And Mehmed II, by the way, who did it, was 22 years old at the time. The Turkish leader, the Turkoman leader, was 22 years old, Mehmed II, when he succeeded in breaching the walls of Constantinople, which had held against such invasions for so many years. It's fascinating. Anyway, the CIA is, of course, involved in this, and I'm sure everyone in this room is familiar with CIA tactics that are totally immoral. And I want to step back and give you one little vignette that some of you may be aware of, and this is supposed to be on a CD, but I forgot the CD. Danny Sheehan did 4 wonderful hours of interview with Gary Null in May and June of, what year is it? It's 2017. I think he did it.
This year.
Was it last year or the year before?
Well, he's repeated them once, but he did them this year. I know, 'cause they
Well,
played on the show.
they played? Okay, but he did them originally. I think it was last year.
Well, it's out of his book coming out.
Okay, and I managed to download them before they took them off, before Gary Null took them off, so he could offer them as a WBAI premium for $85. But I got them for free, and a week or two later they were gone. So I have them. So if anyone wants them, I'll send them to you via Dropbox. Yeah, they're very good. I listen to them over and over again. So Danny, who is one of the great legal heroes in this country, who was Daniel Ellsberg's lawyer, defended him against the charge of treason for bringing out the Pentagon Papers, who was Karen Silkwood's lawyer, her family's lawyer, and who was responsible for bringing out the Iran-Contra scandal and fought the mainstream media to bring it out. He tells that story. He told that story last year in his lecture at the 9/11 symposium. So he begins this 4-hour series, taking us back to him at age 21 or 22 in 1967, taking a class in international relations at Harvard. And who is the professor? Heinrich Kissinger.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So he's taking Kissinger's class in international relations at Harvard in 1967. Okay. I remember the year very well. And he says that Kissinger opened the class by saying, if anyone has any objections to the pursuit of American foreign policy using murder, blackmail, false flag operations, all kinds of threats to people's family. In other words, using these very illegal criminal means, but they're in pursuit of American interests, right? Right? So if anyone has any objections to that, then this class is not for you.
Oh God. Oh.
So as Danny relates it, he looked around the class and sees all these scions of the wealthy, and he's this working class kid from Ohio, come to Harvard, and they're all nodding piously, right? So this, of course, is ends justifies the means, right? It's totally against Kant's categorical imperative. And categorical means that they're always true under every circumstance. And this was Kant's humanism. This is an expression of Kant's humanism. But it's not the basic tenets of the neocon movement. And it's very interesting to read about Kissinger. I was just reading Greg Grandin's wonderful book, Kissinger's Shadow. Kissinger's Shadow. You know who Greg Grandin is? He's the Latin American scholar and professor. I forget where he teaches. But he's brilliant and he's very approachable. I saw him talk about this about 2 years ago, and I didn't buy the book, but I just ordered it. But I read it. I went, I saw it on the shelves at the Strand. I didn't want to pay $14, so I went home and I ordered it for half that. Then I went back to the Strand and read it. So I know what I was talking about. Of course, Kissinger has two major, thick biographies. If I was sitting on them, I'd be this tall. In addition to Christopher Hitchens' very critical biography, he has two biographies. Grandin has gone through this. He's done his homework, and he's gone through Kissinger's 500-page thesis on diplomacy and the goals of diplomacy. And you really get an insight into what non-humanists think, how they pursue foreign policy, and how they sleep at night, how they justify themselves, right? They are not thinking of human rights, ladies and gentlemen. They are thinking that international politics is a great game, and that we have to do everything we can to promote our side and to win, right? And we're all for our side, right? Wait a second.
No consciousness.
Well, certainly no conscience, yes.
I think I would agree with some of the basic points you're making about historical facts, but I think you should be cautious not to make assumptions about exactly what who was thinking when they made the decision that they did under the circumstances that they did. You do not know, nobody knows exactly what who was thinking when.
The conclusion may or may not be correct, but it doesn't mean that we cannot come to conclusions, at least tentatively, and to use that as a way of understanding the particular civilization that it came from, and the civilization within which we live.
Yeah, so let me just continue this. We'll have a question period afterwards. But basically, just read the Arabic right here, everybody. Right, where it should say Allah Akbar, it says Money Akbar. Yeah, money is great. So that's what this is about, my friends. It's about amassing a power and wealth, and we see that at every level. The financialization of our economy. We see inequality going way up. There was an article by David Leonhardt in an op-ed a few days ago in the Times, I think on Monday, where he shows the graph that, yeah, the deep state is succeeding. They're making the super rich, the 0.1%, even richer. And that's the goal of all of these foreign policies. I mean, that's the result. And it's squeezing our country. It's sucking the resources out of our country so that students are in enormous debt. Right, and our healthcare system is still extremely expensive. Our infrastructure is neglected, and municipalities are starving. You know, where the people are starving, and these people are amassing huge sums of money. I assume this is intentional, and yes, that's right. And they're succeeding, and the whole political system is geared to that. It's geared around money, and if you don't see that, then we'll have a longer discussion. But let's not.
Please don't. Let's not have it.
Yeah, we're not going to have it now. This is, I think, I think we can all agree on this, or almost all. Anyway, so we pursue our foreign policy with complete amorality, as Kissinger was saying, criminality, and we conceal it from the public. Right? These were elite students, and the media is complicit. On the media, you are not allowed to talk about the CIA in negative terms, and I've had this experience. You're not allowed to talk about election corruption, except for the things that are made public, like ID cards and gerrymandering. You're not allowed to talk about computerized vote flipping or registration purging. You know, that's been documented. I've tried to get through to these people, and I can't. So this, remember I talked a few talks ago, I mentioned the term inverted totalitarianism. Was anyone here for that? Inverted totalitarianism. That's the Sheldon Wolin term from his 2007 book, Democracy Incorporated, Managed Democracy and the Specter of Inverted Totalitarianism. It's a very useful concept, because he said in the old totalitarianism, if you said something critical of the regime, The brown shirts came at 4 in the morning and took you away, right? And clobbered you over the head, maybe killed you, right? That's the old totalitarianism. But we have a much more benign totalitarianism now because our society is so much larger and more complex. And if a few nuts like me and maybe you say these things, which happen to be true, about the regime and the CIA and the tools of the regime, not enough people will hear us or believe us, and we can always be dismissed as conspiracy theorists. And the news media, including the progressive media, ladies and gentlemen, including The Nation and The Atlantic and Mother Jones, will not talk about the crimes of the CIA. You have to go to other sources. You can get the information. It's in this book. You know, it's in sources like Truth Out, Truth Dig. It's on the web, but you won't find it in the venerable published sources, either mainstream or progressive, and that certainly includes NPR, which is why I don't send them any money. Okay, so let's just go over quickly some of the CIA operations since its formation right after the Second World War. Its first major operation was, what was it?
Cuba.
No. First major operation of the CIA, what was it? Overthrow of Mossadegh. Mossadegh,
Yes,
the Iranian president, duly elected, democratically elected president, because he would only give the version of British Petroleum, was called something else back then, 50% of the revenues from the oil, and they wanted more. Okay, so the Brits came to us, and we, meaning the CIA, I wasn't part of it, I was too young. The CIA used sectarian religious groups to foment a quickie rebellion, and took him out in what was called Operation Ajax. And there's a graphic history, I won't call it a novel because it's fact, on it. I haven't read it, but it's beautiful. Operation Ajax, you can get this. It's a graphic book, in other words, cartoon. Yeah, on Operation Ajax. Yeah.
William Bloom also wrote that very, very
Okay,
well.
and what's his name? The Iranians. Hello, come on. Okay, then the next one was the Arbenz affair in Guatemala, where hundreds of thousands of Mayans, ethnic Mayans, were killed, 1954. There was the murder of Lumumba in 1961, who held hope for democracy and development in the Congo after a terribly oppressive Belgian colonial regime. Then the murder of Kennedy, of course, in '63, who wanted to get rid of the CIA. He was actually a convert. He came in as a cold warrior to the right of Nixon, if you remember, and some of you remember, I remember, and saw it, was horrified at what the CIA was up to, and of course was outraged that the CIA and Allen Dulles tried to blackmail him into sending in the Marines in the Bay of Pigs. Remember? Dulles came up and said, we're going to do an invasion. And Kennedy said, okay, you can do an invasion, but don't count on my support. If you're claiming that the Cuban people are going to rise up and throw off the hated Castro, then you can go ahead and do it. But if they don't, I ain't coming. Well,
That was his death knell.
So Kennedy was approached at a party by Dulles, who told him, Mr. President, we're in trouble. We need the Marines. And Kennedy blew his top and said, you're not getting them. But Dulles had a backup plan. He had air support that was supposed to come in from Mexico, except they didn't account for the 1 hour time difference between Mexico and Cuba. And so they were an hour late. That was all they needed. That was right. That's all they needed. One of the great ironies of history, or the minor ironies. And so the Bay of Pigs invasion failed, and got no support, and the people were caught. But guess what? Three of those Bay of Pigs alumni were the shooters of Kennedy. A little over a year later, and Danny Sheehan knows their names. Danny Sheen has told us their names. Yeah, do you remember their names?
No.
Oh, okay.
It's all in his book.
Yeah, okay, and I heard, I'd love to see his book, yeah. Okay, now, then, oh, there was also Operation Northwoods. Anyone hear of that?
That's where he axed it, refused to.
That's right, it didn't happen. You didn't hear about it maybe because it didn't happen. But the certain generals wanted to mount a false flag operation in Cuba. In other words, send operatives in, cause mayhem, and blame it on Castro and start a rebellion. And Kennedy scotched it. He refused to let it happen. But that's the sort of thing that we were willing to do.
Right. There was one other, Salvador Allende, and Torres was involved.
That wasn't until 73.
Yeah, that was in '73, and that was Kissinger and ITT. I don't know what the CIA's role in it was, but I assume it had a role because they were bribing labor unions to come out against Allende.
My question was about that kind of show.
What's that?
My question was going to be about that kind of show.
Yes, I once did a paper on him in high school. Was his plane crash sabotage? Doug Hammarskjöld, the first.
Oh, Doug.
Yeah.
Yes,
There was also Operation Gladio. How many of you have heard of Operation Gladio? Okay, Joe. Anyone else? Okay, this is very interesting. I only heard about it last year at the 9/11 symposium from a retired judge from the Italian Supreme Court. But there's a great deal of literature on this. This was the collaboration among NATO countries led by the CIA and the Italian right wing to suppress the Italian left wing because they were much too close to power. You may know that the Italian Communist Party was a parliamentary party, unlike our Communist Party. They were a very responsible party. They ran things in Bologna. They had a bailiwick. But there was kind of a covert civil war that went on in the late 70s, and I have this from an Italian communist I had an extended conversation with in Italian last year in Taranto, who gave me a little insight into this. And then I came back and I heard this imposedimento judge. But there's literature on this, and it's extremely nefarious. There were assassinations, there were lots of false flag things. For example, the assassination of Aldo Moro was apparently a Gladio operation that was attributed to the Brigade Rosse, the Red Brigades, right? And even Bader Meinhof in Germany was infiltrated by agents of Gladio and the CIA. So that was a major operation to deactivate the Italian communists. Then there was the Iran-Contra affair in the 1980s. And the importation of cocaine into neighborhoods in the U.S., minority neighborhoods in the U.S., in the 80s and 90s to raise money for illegal operations abroad, which was discovered almost by accident by Gary Webb, writing for the, what was it, the Mercury News of Down Bay, San Jose Mercury News, thank you. And he got it published in the Mercury News, and then all of a sudden, the rest of the U.S. press attacked him because he was exposing the CIA, and the Mercury News fired him, and this went on for a couple years, and finally he supposedly committed suicide, right, with 2 bullets to his head.
And the notes from his new book disappeared.
Yeah, and how do you do that with 2 bullets? You have to shoot very fast.
23
Anyway.
stab wounds to the back. The worst case of suicide I ever saw.
What did you say, 23 what?
23 stab wounds to the back. The worst case of suicide I ever saw.
Who was that? That was not Gary Webb.
Well,
that was somebody else.
The 23 stab wounds was Caesar. I don't know who came up
Caesar.
with
Julius Caesar?
Julius Caesar.
Well, that wasn't a suicide. We know who did that. He spoke to the crowd after that.
Gary Webb's book actually did not accuse the CIA of anything. All he said was they looked the other way while the Contras imported the cocaine.
McCain and his assistant for Middle Eastern Affairs, Elizabeth O. something-y, met with the head of ISIS. And we have photographs of them. together. Apparently ISIS, first of all, they were not real Islamists. They were being financed by us, the Saudis, the Qataris were very, very much involved in that. The Turks, and they set up a thing with the oil in Syria. They would sell the oil. There was a great deal of oil. They would sell the oil at low prices to Turkish agents, possibly the Turkish mafia, who would then resell it at a great profit. And guess who happened to be involved in that, reaping enormous profits?
Sure.
Guess who? Your favorite Turkish dictator. Erdogan. Erdogan. Why do you think he became such a dictator? He probably, this is a supposition, I don't know, but I'm just connecting dots. I mean, he clamps down on his country and jails 1,000 journalists at the time that this whole scheme heats up, and he's making money hand over fist from reselling the oil that ISIS is supplying him with. It's really dirty. Okay? Israel, the Mossad, is supporting them, getting oil rights to the Golan Heights. They have the Golan Heights, and there's oil under the Golan Heights. And it says also in this book that Israeli citizens would come out and watch the fighting. You know, be taking pictures of the fighting at a distance, and no one would be shooting at them. Okay? I mentioned this out. Now the Qataris are very interesting because Qatar owns a major news source, namely, what is it? Al Jazeera. It's owned by the Sheikh of Qatar. Okay, so a friend of mine, when I mentioned what I was writing, she said, "Oh, this is horrible. You know, you think Assad is good and the U.S. is bad. It's much too simplistic." Of course, it's much more complicated than that. And then she cited an Al Jazeera article, which I looked at, and in fact, in the light of this book, I actually made notes. And I don't know if we have time to go through that whole thing, but Al Jazeera gives a background story of the whole Syrian thing. And now, what's happening, and I'll just summarize it, is that these ISIS groups go in, or al-Nusra groups go in. They have snipers, they have death squads, and they have put together a crude version of sarin poison gas, which is not as pure as the chemical supplies that Assad has. So you can kind of tell the difference. And also their delivery systems, their delivery systems are not as accurate. So we have sarin, terrible poison gas that kills in 15 minutes, coming from ISIS. We have them sniping, just killing people at random. We have death squads. We have bombing of civilians. And it's all blamed on the Syrian army and Assad. In other words, it's a giant repeated false flag going on in Syria. Now, who is hip to this? Who is onto this? Who realizes what's going on in addition to Assad? That's right. Say it louder. Who said it? Someone said it. Putin knows, right? And the Iranians know. And Putin has made statements to that effect. And of course, we just dismiss them as, blather, and of course he's going to say that. Of course he's going to tell us we're wrong. But in the light of what we know about the CIA, what we know about our support of ISIS, and we have McCain in the same photograph, when Putin says, "It is alarming that military intervention in internal conflicts in foreign countries has become commonplace for the United States. Is it in America's long-term interest? I doubt it. Millions around the world increasingly see America not as a model of democracy, but as relying solely on brute force, cobbling coalitions together under the slogan, 'You're either with us or against us.'" That's pretty gentle. That's things. What? Yeah, but that's absolutely. Now, Assad was interviewed by Der Spiegel, and it was a kind of a hostile interview. The Der Spiegel guy was saying, "Well, why are you bombing your own citizens?" And I was saying, Assad was saying, "Well, that's ridiculous. I'm not doing it." I mean, it's just blanket denial. Der Spiegel. This doesn't rule out that the army was responsible for the attack, the Syrian army. Western intelligence services intercepted phone calls in which your commanders used the general command to use poison gas. Assad. "This is a complete fabrication and forgery, and I will not waste my time with such allegations." Der Spiegel. Isn't it puzzling that we in the West have a completely different assessment of the situation? Assad. In fact, your region is always late in recognizing reality and is extremely slow in understanding this reality. In the beginning, we talked about violent protests while you talked about peaceful demonstrations. In other words, in Syria, he was seeing that there were these violent protests coming from the ISIS groups, right, fake groups. And the Americans had to portray this as peaceful demonstrations that were fired on by Syrian forces, right, blaming them, right? But he saw them as violent provocations.
International COINTELPRO.
Oh, that's another one. That's in the 70s. When we started talking about extremists, you were still talking about some militants. When we talked about Al Qaeda, you were still talking about a few terrorists, although they are actually the majority, meaning Al Qaeda. Secretary of State Kerry still sticks to the past and talks about 20%. This is exactly what I meant with the reality deficit you have. So, and this goes on. But Assad is very firm in saying that it's not his forces shooting his people, and he wouldn't do that. And then we have all this evidence that his position is actually true. And of course, this goes along with CIA techniques. It's in the manual. It's what Kissinger was talking about. Yes, we're allowed to do anything we want. And it's part of the neocon strategy to break up the last of the three secular functioning states and to create three separate little states.
In the Middle East, you mean?
Yeah, in the Middle East, yeah, because we want their oil. Oh, Elizabeth O'Baghy is her name, right? She falsely claimed to have this is McCain's advisor to the Middle East. She falsely claimed to have a PhD from Georgetown. And they went to Syria unofficially in 2013 and met with and were photographed with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and Mohammed Noor of the Northern Storm Brigade of the ISIS-lined al-Nusra Front, along with 20 other Syrian rebel brigade commanders. You know, there's so much more detail to this that I'd love you to read in this book with elaborate citations. And so reading this completely sorted it out for me. I mean, I was as confused as anybody else. Who are the good guys? Why are there so many people loyal to Assad if he's gassing and firing on his own people? But he wasn't. It was fake. It was false flag operations, and continuous ones. Oh, also, this woman, Elizabeth O'Baghy, was working for Kimberly Kagan, the wife of arch neocon Zionist Frederick Kagan of the right-wing American Enterprise Institute, and sister-in-law of Robert Kagan, the resident neocon scholar of the Brookings Institution, and his wife, Victoria Newland, the neoconservative Assistant Secretary for European and Eurasian Affairs at the State Department. And due to her resume fraud, she was officially fired as the Syria analyst in the Institute for the Study of War, which is an influential neocon operation in D.C. that had major influence over U.S. foreign policy. But she continued on as the political director of the Syrian Emergency Task Force, SETF, an NGO, a non-government organization, a non-profit supported by neocon Freedom House and the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. SETF admitted to having subcontracts with the U.S. and British governments to provide aid to the Syrian opposition. All right. And it was an extreme anti-Assad organization that used Pentagon-grade psychological warfare tactics to demonize the Assad government and falsely blame him for atrocities carried out by Syrian rebels, including sarin and chlorine gas. I forgot to mention the term psychological warfare, PSYOPs, psychological operations, a very important part of the CIA quiver, their weapons to defeat the enemy. Now, so the goals of all this is, as I said, to divide up these states, to render their constituted governments ineffective, and then to have power over them and to gain their resources. And also, as the U.S. spends money on hostilities, although we're practically out, the military-industrial complex gets richer. And the people like Halliburton, the groups like Halliburton that service our military also also get richer. So war is a way of siphoning money out of the U.S. Treasury, your money and my money, in the name of defense, whereas it's really pushing for the neocon agenda, which is domination, to make them even richer.
Defense is a euphemism.
What?
Defense is a euphemism.
Indeed.
What about humanism?
No, defense is a euphemism.
Oh, defense. Oh, defense is not even a euphemism. It's total deception. And also, Israel has had a very nefarious role in all of this. Israel goes along with the neocon agenda to neutralize these countries. There's a whole explanation of 9/11 that's extremely hot to handle, but I read it by Christopher Bolin on the Mossad's planning of the 9/11 attacks. It's extremely convincing, and it says basically that the planning went on for 10 to 20 years, and was spearheaded by the terrorists in Israel's government, Shamir and Begin. Well, Begin was out of the picture earlier on, Sharon, and carried out by Israeli company, or through Israeli companies that were very integrated into the U.S. military's communication system. In fact, its communication system has been provided by an Israeli company, and many of the companies had Muslim fronts. They were trying to pretend they were Muslim companies, and the report that the Israelis working at the World Trade Center did receive texts in Hebrew telling them not to go to work has been confirmed, and we know the company that supplied them. And of course, the 5 Mossad members who were picked up videoing and celebrating the attacks from Weehawken was confirmed. We know their names. Yeah. So Israel is up to its ears. We're talking about Likud. We're talking about reactionary Israel. We're talking about criminal Israel. We're not talking about all Israelis, of course. Just like we're not talking about all Americans. We're certainly not talking about all Jews. I'm one of them. But the greed for territory and the ethnocracy that makes Palestinian citizens second-class citizens and non-citizens, practically non-people, is a terrible violation of human rights. And our whole political system, elected officials are complicit with it, and bought off by AIPAC people too. So that's what we're up against, ladies and gentlemen. And if you have any questions or comments, or want to scream at me, I'll put on my glasses so I can see you. Thank you very much. Yes.
I do. I wouldn't say that. I guess I really want to talk about epistemology.
Oh, well, we're having an epistemology meeting right after this meeting. No, go ahead. No, I'm teasing you, but go ahead.
Okay. Epistemology is how do we know what we know.
Right.
You presented a particular view of, I would say, of the world and causality and politics and, human relations and, and some other things, which is at variance with the way I perceive it.
Well, you and the whole media, the mainstream media.
No.
No? Okay.
No, that's not what I'm talking about.
All right, good.
I'm not talking about specific facts.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not in a position to know the specific facts.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so I don't have a particular...
Well, you can find them out.
I don't...
They're available.
That's not what I'm talking about.
Okay, go ahead. Tell me what you're talking about. Go ahead.
Right? I do have a life apart from what you're saying now, and I do think that life is meaningful. I'm not talking about the facts now, right? I'm talking about the sum of the facts. I'm talking about this larger view about experience and what happens in the world. In terms of the 18th century, right? I can follow you, right? It's orderly, Because
Well, we're looking at it from a distance.
so
What is your point and what is your question? I mean, you could. I'm sure you could give your own lecture, but let me get to the point. And what are you actually trying to say? Because other people have questions too. You'll forgive me for being.
Stop now.
No, I want to know. You haven't said anything. You haven't come to your point.
I thought there's a tremendous divergence
Mm-hmm.
in the kind of picture that you have
Mm-hmm.
proposed with the way that I experience
Mm-hmm.
things in terms of human nature, right? And just what I know about the complexity
Mm-hmm.
of the world.
Okay.
And it seems
Yeah, fair
to me that this is something fundamental about the picture that you have presented.
Now, this is a very good question. I'll tell you why. It's because the conduct of our foreign policy and the absolute immorality of our foreign policy and the agendas of our neocons are effectively concealed from the American public. So there is an epistemological gap, all right, discontinuity. The question is, can we overcome that? To what degree can we overcome that? How much certainty do we have? And there's no such thing as absolute certainty. And these neocons do not have absolute power either. They frequently lose. You know, they take giant risks, spend our money, and they're overcome by other forces. Now, they won in Libya pretty clearly. The situation in Iraq is, well, actually they have what they want. They have access to the oil. Our oil companies have access to the oil, and our government was serving the oil companies. And the Iraqi people are not benefiting, and their society, which was fairly functional, is not working for them anymore. They live in fear. So, and we've wrecked the lives of millions of people in order for this small number of people to gain profits. These are known facts, all right? And they conform to patterns. And they conform to imperial patterns going back to other empires, and they conform to our practices going back 50 years. All right, this is not in dispute. But our media do not talk about this. That's not in dispute either. And there's a kind of informal self-censorship going on, which is the nature of inverted totalitarianism. Our media will not talk about this. There's a certain standard. I mean, I called up Brian Lehrer yesterday, the day before yesterday, because he was having a discussion on Venezuela, you know, which is falling apart, and Chavez died of cancer very rapidly, like Jack Ruby did, right? And so there are all kinds of reasons to suspect CIA involvement, except I haven't heard anything concrete about it. So I called up and told the screener, yeah, I'd like to know if the interviewee has heard any talk in Venezuela about CIA activity. And I waited and waited, and finally she got back to me and said, oh, he's only taking questions from people with direct connections to Venezuela. And the next person to call was a New Yorker who happened to live in Panama with no direct connection. So I thought, oh, Brian doesn't want to mention CIA. That's inverted totalitarianism in action. It's very benign. He wasn't telling me never call again, Joel from Union. That's me, that's how I identify them.
I think it's going to get worse. We are going to have, you know, all kinds of suppression on purpose and blatant, you know, to...
Yeah, well, listen, the following day, yesterday, Carol Anderson was on, who wrote the wonderful book called White Rage, highly recommended, in which she documents how every major advance by the black community in this country has been countered by efforts to keep black people down. The Voting Rights Act, and then the Southern Strategy. Obama's elected, and we have, and of course we have the old drug war, which is mainly visited upon black people, and it gets lots of them thrown in jail. Okay, and when they're thrown in jail, they can't vote. And then she mentioned limits on black voting, namely voter ID laws and gerrymandering. So I wrote to her and I said, that was a wonderful interview, and I love your book. But you know, there are other ways too. There's all this purging of registrations that Greg Palast has shown us in his documentary, The Best Democracy Money Can Buy, A Tale of Billionaires and Ballot Bandits. And the vote flipping that Jonathan Simon has written about. My friend Jonathan Simon and I run the two panels at the Left Forum on election corruption. And Bob Petrakis, and Harvey Wasserman wrote about it, she wrote me back. She wrote me back. She's a professor at Emory. She said, oh yeah, I know about these things. And I'm going to write about them. I had mentioned that Reverend Barber knows about them too. I wrote her back today. I said, oh, I'm so glad you know about them. Now, were you asked not to mention them by Brian Lehrer? Because you're not allowed to mention these things on the air, in the mainstream media. Right? You can mention the above-the-line things, the ones that everyone knows that are legal actions, like voter ID and gerrymandering, but you can't mention the illegal actions that we have massive evidence for. And I tried to get the Nation to acknowledge this. They won't. Their guy on the election beat, Ari Berman, talks elaborately about these things above the line, but nothing that's secret. I wrote him a letter to the Nation. You know, Ari Berman must be working very hard to ignore these other things going on his beat. It's astonishing that he doesn't know about them. But they won't talk. That's inverted totalitarianism.
I was watching Hugh Downs many years ago, actually. It was a call-in thing, and somebody was going to ask a question about Israel. And the look of terror on Hugh Downs' face at the possibility that he would have to say something below the line was eloquent.
Yeah, right. Well, you know now, there's a proposal for a law in this country that you're not allowed to speak against Israel. Now, this violates the Constitution, right? We're not allowed to talk about human rights. It's ridiculous. This gentleman had a question.
I will not make any comment about CIA because they will send me to Paris town with Lady Diana. The motto of imperialism is divide and rule.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly what I'm talking about here. The statelets instead of these constituted secular states. Thank you. Yeah, Pamela, do you have a comment?
How does the, what is it, the Council on Foreign Relations?
Yeah.
How does this play in with this?
Well, they're a very conservative group. They're certainly support the neocon agenda. I mean, it's, you know, I highly recommend this book. Okay, it's called ISIS is Us: The Shocking Truth Behind the Army of Terror. There's so much documentation in this. I mean, it's
What's the name of the author one more time?
Oh, the author is Washington's blog, Wayne Madsen, Syrian girl partisan, who's a blogger. We have her name. Her name is Miriam something, and John Paul Leonard, and then there are a few other people in here. Webster Tarpley gets a section, but the documentation is massive, and I've hardly given you any of it.